All right, hello everyone, and welcome to 2021. This is like the first real video I've recorded for 2021, and we are going to be making a video about tips for your upcoming SAC. This is probably going to be part one of two. What I'm going to be doing in this video is just going through each key knowledge one by one, and basically telling you what kind of questions are likely to be asked about it on your SAC, and what words you should probably making sure you include in those. So all these slides are really going to be, other than one generic overview slide, is the key knowledge dot point. And then under it, we're going to scribble a bunch of things that we think are important. So we'll probably go through the first few, well, really there's 16 dot points. We'll probably go through the first 8 in this video. And then in a video that I'll probably record tonight or tomorrow, we'll go through the next 8. It's really hot today. It's 40 degrees. It's Monday, the 25th of January. Hopefully your SAC's not straight away when you get back. It could be, but let's get into a bit of an overview. So, depending on your school, you're either going to have your SAC as 2 parts or 1 part. I have it as 1 part because I think that it's more useful that way. This content all goes together really well. And you're likely to have some multiple choice questions, some short answer questions, and it's worth approximately 40% of your unit 3, which is about 10% of your overall. But that doesn't matter too much. A lot of people freak out about this first SAC because it's worth a lot. It's weighed really heavily, and a lot of people do poorly on it. So these are hopefully going to be some tips and tricks that will help you do well. I tend to have this SAC out of 40 marks, mainly because it works out really simply in terms of the math of it. For me, that usually means 10 multiple choice questions and then 6 or 7 short answer questions, varying in their mark allocation. Depending on where you're at, they could be 5 multiple choice questions. I always like having more because that's a skill that's really important at the end of the year on your final exam. So getting into the first thing that you need to know, relative scarcity, needs, wants, resources, and opportunity costs. So this could very easily be a multiple choice question or a short answer question. Either way, it tends to be relatively low mark. It tends to be like something that you need to define. So you might get a multiple choice question that's just like, which of these gives the best explanation of relative scarcity, or you might just get a short answer question that's like, define relative scarcity or explain why relative scarcity is the basic economic problem. The really important thing that you need to have in an answer and what they're looking for is unlimited needs and wants. It's been a while since I've done this and my handwriting hasn't gone as terrible as I expected it to. Unlimited needs and wants and limited resources. If you have those two things, it's probably going to be, oh guys, felt limited wrong, the correct answer. If you don't have these things, you're probably not going to get the full marks. So it's really important. Underneath that, we also have resources up here. So it's really important to know your natural, labor, and capital, and to be able to give examples of each of those. So if it's in a short answer question, whenever you talk about any of them, I'd probably briefly define it and say an example of it. So natural, gifts of nature, labor, human talent, capital, your plant and machinery, etc. And then give a specific example because that's what they're going to want to see. Then lastly, we've got opportunity cost. This can come up in multiple choice or short answer. Often in multiple choice, it's like which of the following would be an opportunity cost for blank, and it's choosing the one that is the value foregone, or an opportunity cost, having to define it or give an example of an opportunity cost of doing something or another. Most often I see opportunity cost in multiple choice. So what's an opportunity cost of the government spending 270 billion on military? And you look through the options and one might be they could have spent that money on education, and then you'd be like, well, I'm going to pick that answer. So it's likely to come up in that way. With relative scarcity and multiple choice, it's going to be, they're going to give you a whole bunch of different things where limited and unlimited are in the wrong spots, or it's both unlimited or it's both limited. So it's just going to be getting you to look at the most correct answer. And that tends to be it for this first dot point. Next up, the nature of conditions for a perfectly competitive market. So once again, this can be multiple choice or short answer. If it's in multiple choice, it's like usually which of the following is not a condition of. So then it'll be like, I'll just give you 3 of them will be a condition for a perfectly competitive market and 1 won't be. And it's only going to be if you know it that you're going to be able to get that correct. It was short answer in the most recent VCAR exam in the 2021, which they asked about the conditions of a perfectly competitive market. So if it's in a short answer question, you're going to have to describe the features. So I believe it was only a 2-mark question in the 2020 exam. Don't quote me on that. It could have been 4 marks. But you don't need to, if it's in the short answer, you're going to have to describe the features. And usually it's going to be describe the features and talk about how that leads to increased efficiency. So link to increased efficiency. One of these things is going to kind of tie in a little bit later on, so we'll probably end up repeating it. But I've noticed a lot in questions that students have been sending me. A lot's been coming up about evaluate the market or evaluate perfectly competitive markets at maximizing society's living standards. And whenever you get evaluate, it's all about weighing up the strengths and weaknesses. And that's really, really important to do. Some people just end up going into describing all the features of the competitive market and saying that will maximize living standards, but it won't always. So it's getting a little bit into market failure, which we'll talk about in part 2 of this, but really, really important to think about the negatives of perfectly competitive markets, which can be the fact that perfectly competitive markets often will overproduce socially undesirable goods and services, and that will lead to worse living standards overall. All right, now we've got the law of demand, the demand curve, including movements along and shifts of the demand curve. So you need to be able to draw demand supply curves and need to be fully labeled. So what's going to be important with that is that you're going to need to be able to say price, quantity, you're going to need a title, and you're going to need the demand curve sloping in the right direction. That's your general what you need in the first place. Whenever you're displaying movements, so a movement is just when there has been a change in price and that leads to a change in quantity demanded. When you're looking at that, you're talking about like maybe P1 and P2, what happens in that instance. And then you're going to go, all right, from P1, we have Q1 here, and then we move to Q2. And that's a movement. We've just moved from one point on the same curve to another because there's just been a change in price. If it is moving that way, we call that an expansion of demand. And that's really, really important to use that terminology. If demand increases, that's an expansion. If it decreases, so increasing equals expansion. If it decreases, that's a contraction. And that comes up a lot in short answer. Or you might get a question in multiple choice, which is just like, which of the following would cause an expansion in quantity demanded? And you just need to say a decrease in price, or whichever one is a decrease in price. And people often get that wrong or get movements confused, but that terminology is really, really incredibly important. Shifts in the demand curve. So if we now go back to my black pen and we draw another curve, we'll do this one less fully labeled because we are wanting to get through as much as possible without it being too long a video, because I know too long videos really just make people switch off. So we've got a demand curve. That's a very, very poor demand curve, but anything that gives a shift is where you're going to create a whole new line either to the right or the left of it. So call this D2 and this one D1. If it shifts to the right, that is favorable. If it shifts to the left, that is unfavorable. And that is the terminology you need to use. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not positive, it's not negative, favorable and unfavorable. So you need to be able to draw those. You need to be able to draw those well. You need to be able to show what is happening. Later on, we'll get about markets, but that's really, really important. You also need to know the law of demand is that as price decreases, quantity demanded increases. If you can put that into words, so that's the full definition. You can do it the opposite way as well. You can talk about when price increases, quantity demand decreases. Either way, that's what you need in that as a definition. Then we've got factors likely to affect the demand and position of the demand curve. So this is just saying things that are going to cause shifts. So when we've got a demand curve, you need to be able to talk about things that are going to cause a whole new demand curve. So when we're doing this, you're going to need to be able to talk about anything that's going to create more demand at the same price. I really like, there's a list of these. There's a list in the study design. I cut them off here. I recommend looking at them. They're the only ones that can be specifically asked of you, and they're the ones that are being expected. You can use anything as long as it is factually accurate. But those are the specific ones that I recommend you use because they are the most likely ones that are going to come up. So anything favorable is where there is more demand at the same price. To illustrate that, if we have P1 and we have a favorable shift, so let's get a new line happening over here, call it D1. If there is a favorable shift here at the same price, people are demanding much more. That's favorable shift. So something that can cause a favorable shift are things like successful advertising. The easiest one, in my opinion. You have an increase in disposable income. You could have a decrease in personal income tax. Anything like that, you can say there will be more demand at any given price. And then the opposite is true for unfavorable shifts. So if you want to get to this point, you could say like seasonal factors, you could say a decrease in disposable income, you could say an increase in personal income tax, change in fashions and tastes. Anything like that would lead to an unfavorable shift where there is less demanded at the same price. And you need to be able to illustrate that, but also describe certain situations that would cause that to happen. Law of supply. So then we've got, if we look at our supply curve, we're going to draw that. We've got the same labeling in terms of price. We've got quantity over here. You're going to have a title, which is going to be, should have said this before as well, market for, and then whatever your market is. Your supply curve slopes upwards. I've said this in the past, but the word supply has up in it. That's how I remember which way it goes. That's going to be, you're going to want to have in brackets what your units are. That's going to be your general gist of it. With supply, your definition is as price increases, quantity supplied increases, and that we call that an expansion of supply. So if we have a certain price here, if we have P1 and we have P2, we draw that down. We've got Q1 here, Q2 over here. As you can see, there's been an expansion in quantity supplied. The opposite is true. If price falls, they don't want to supply as much because they're not going to make as much profit. When price increases, they want to supply more. Businesses are profit motivated, therefore they want to supply more at whatever price is happening. Then we've got our second curve to show shifts. So we're going to do price, quantity, title. Let's go some blue lines now, because why not? For our supply curve, unfavorable shifts are to the left, and favorable shifts are to the right. So you need to be able to say that as well. So that's the drawings for those. So then factors likely to affect supply and position of supply curve. So factors that affect supply really boil down to two things, in my opinion. So if we have these two things, it's going to be things that affect your productivity or efficiency, and things that affect your cost of production. No matter what the supply side factor is, you can kind of boil it down to one of these 2 points. The ones listed in studies on the climate change, well, climate change, that's going to affect your productivity because either you can't work or it's going to affect your cost of production because resources become more expensive. No matter what supply side factor you're talking about, like an increase in business tax, well, that's going to lead to the cost of production being higher, which makes businesses less likely to want to produce. So these are anything other than sales price that create a whole new supply curve. So if we look at our supply curve and we look at it from like we're looking at it before, that's not correct. Title, and we draw our lines back in. We've got price, we've got quantity. So unfavorable, going to be anything that makes you less productive or increase cost of production. Favorable is going to be anything where your cost of production decreases or your productivity increases. So those two factors, you can boil it down. Any factor you're given, those two things can explain it. And it makes it far easier to remember. Then you can explain why there is more or less supplied at any given price. Now, we've got the effects of changes in supply or demand on equilibrium prices and quantity traded. This is where we're going to get into a little bit of the more complex stuff. So we're probably going to call it after this one. So this is when you're drawing the market. So we've got our title, we've got price, we've got quantity. We draw both axes or both curves. There's a couple of things that we want to talk about here. So the simplest things are knowing what's happening when the price is above the equilibrium point and what's happening when the price is below the equilibrium point. Often you get questions like this, like what happens when the price is set at this? You talk about the quantity demand and quantity supplied, you give the units and the price specifically and say exactly what's happening. So in this case, if the price is set above the equilibrium price, what's happening is there's too much being supplied and not enough being demanded. And we call that a surplus. When you're below, there's a lot more demand than there is supply, and we call that a shortage. There are other words for these, like surplus can also be called oversupply or glut, and shortage can also be called an undersupply, but that's up to you, whichever you prefer using. So that's one thing, knowing when shortages and surpluses occur. Surpluses occur when the price is above the equilibrium point, shortages occur when it is below it. Now when things get more complicated, you often get questions in the multiple choice, depending on where the SAC is from, it can get pretty messy. So if we have this, it's like, you might get a question like, they love using product X and product Y. I often recommend making those actual products because it makes it make more sense to me. But you'll get a situation where it's like, if there is favorable advertising for product X, what is going to happen in the market? And then you've got to work out, well, that's a favorable shift in demand. So there's going to be a new demand curve. Suddenly there is going to be a shortage overall. And then we get to a new equilibrium price where there's slightly more supplied, but at a higher price. Things get pretty complex here. So I've got other videos where I look at things around this in a lot more detail. I really recommend looking at my video about past exam questions from Unit 3 Area Study 1, because I cover this in a lot of detail. I'll put a link to it in the description below, but I highly recommend getting onto that to look at this, because often you'll get a situation talking about explain what happens in a market and how you get to a new equilibrium price. And I mentioned this in the other videos, so highly recommend going back into that if you haven't already. But you really need to talk about what's happening in the market step by step. So when there has been a favorable shift in demand, at first there is more demand at the same price. This causes a shortage, which then consumers bid up prices until a new equilibrium point is formed. And so that's essentially what we're going to talk about for this first part of it. There's a lot here. There's some things we could have gone into in a bit more detail, but we don't have all the time in the world. So later on or tomorrow, we're going to go through the relative prices in markets on the allocation of resources and the effect on living standards. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, you check out my website. I've got a blog on there where I'm going to write about economic stuff all year. So that is therunningeconomy.com. And if you are on there and you are interested, I've also started a Discord for VC economics, where a whole bunch of teachers from different schools have signed up, willing to try and help other students if they need help along the way. Obviously, this is within reason. Teachers are very busy. We have a lot going on. But if they have free time and they want to help, they're more than happy to do that. I'm hoping that eventually enough students will get on board that students can help each other out no matter which school they're from, share questions, etc., as long as they're not sharing SACs that schools have bought, because that is a breach of copyright and I can't have that on the channel. But check that out. There is a link to it on the website. Otherwise, there's a link to it in my YouTube profile. We will continue this later on and get through the rest. If you have any questions, comment below, or send me an email or join the Discord and ask. Either way, I hope you have had a great holidays and you're ready to hit the ground running in 2021. And I hope you have a wonderful day and cool down. Catch you later. Goodbye.